most important definitions in Article 100 is dwelling units. And the reason that it's so critical that you understand a dwelling unit, and you've got to really understand this definition, is because, generally speaking, we have rules for dwelling units and we have rules for other than dwelling units. So we have rules for dwellings and we have rules for everything else. If you go to 210.8, for example, for GFCIs, A talks about the GFCI requirements for dwellings. B talks about the GFCI requirements for other than dwellings as it relates to receptacles. 210.52 talks about dwelling unit receptacles. Where do you need receptacles in a dwelling unit? You'd read 210.52. Where do you need receptacles for other than dwelling units? Well, you pretty much don't, right? And a couple of exceptions, meeting rooms, areas that require servicing, things like that. But the difference between a dwelling unit and everything else is something that you really need to be very familiar with. So when we look at the definition of a dwelling unit, it's a single unit with complete and independent living facilities, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. Now, of course, the first thing that we're going to think of is a house. And indeed, that is a dwelling unit and probably the most common type of a dwelling unit. Single unit, complete independent living facilities, permanent provisions for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. Nice and easy, right? Well, there are other facilities that are very close to dwelling units but might not quite be a dwelling unit. We talked about dormitory in a previous video, and that's a new term that was defined in the 2020, but before we had that definition, it was quite difficult to figure out what the requirements are for places like a fire station or student housing at a university, things that are dormitory units. So a dormitory unit is not a dwelling unit. What about a hotel or a motel? Are those considered dwelling units? Well, the answer is sometimes. Again, if you read the definition, does your hotel room or your motel room, does it have complete and independent living facilities? Sure. Yeah, it's got a bed, it's got, a place to watch TV and what have you. Does it have permanent provisions for living, sleeping? Yes and yes. Does it have permanent provisions for sanitation? Of course, it's going to have a bathroom. So really it boils down to this. Does it have permanent provisions for cooking? Now, a lot of hotels do not. Here in this photograph, this did not have permanent provisions for cooking. But I stay in a fair amount of hotels. I mean, my job is traveling around teaching the code. So I stay in a lot of hotels. And it's getting more and more common where the hotels that I stay in do have permanent provisions for cooking. And in that case, they comply with, they meet the definition of a dwelling unit. So looking at this photograph here, this is a dwelling unit. It's got independent living facilities, permanent provisions for living, sleeping, cooking, and sanitation. So when you get into the requirements for circuiting in Article 210 and GFCI protection, AFCI protection, tamper-resistant receptacles, it's imperative to know what a dwelling unit is and what a dwelling unit is not. Now, we break down dwelling units into three main classifications. We have a one-family dwelling unit, which of course is just a building that consists solely of one dwelling unit. So if you have your own home, that's probably a single-family dwelling. If you have a duplex, that's going to be a two-family dwelling, a building that consists solely of two dwelling units. So here in the picture, we've got a duplex. And then, of course, we have a multifamily dwelling as well, and that's a building that contains three or more dwelling units. So sometimes we'll have rules for dwelling units and other than dwelling units. Sometimes we'll have requirements for one and two family dwelling units and everything else. Some of the requirements for swimming pools, for example. In 680, I want to say it's 42, the emergency switch for hot tubs. That used to be required for other than dwelling units. Now it's required for other than one and two family dwelling units. So it's important to know what a one family, a two family, or a multifamily dwelling unit is.